data-driven lives of wargaming miniatures. Please give it up for Dimitrios.
Right, thank you. So, as you heard, I'm here today to talk to you about the data-driven lives of wargaming miniatures, which is basically our way of saying that we are exploring digital footprints in the Internet of Things. So, what does that mean? First up, let's take a step back and talk a little bit, very quickly, about object provenance. You see, we are surrounded by meaningful and valuable objects to us, both sentimentally and financially. I mean, this is a sort of intuitive thing. And this is primarily due to the memories, narratives, and provenance that we have associated with them. So basically, in a word, their footprint. Now, you can imagine where I'm going with this. You've got your cultural artifacts, gift you were given from a loved one, family heirlooms, things that are important simply because of famous people who owned them or used them, or just because they're unique and rare to find. So, things get interesting, though, because of the Internet of Things era that we're in, which is probably a line you've been hearing quite a lot recently. And this becomes interesting because objects gain the ability to have digital footprints, which will be indexable and accessible and searchable, Googleable, if you will. And there are quite a few interesting projects in this space, such as the Tales of Things project, which allowed users to tag the physical objects with stories, which they could then share in order to investigate social memory. There is the very interesting Significant Objects project, where what they did, they investigated value, and what they did was buy a bunch of thrift store items for about $1 each, and then got professional writers to write a backstory for them, a short story, which they then used as the item description on eBay. And these items then sold for about 40 times their original value, so clear link there. Then we see evidence of narrative creations purely from tracking data, such as in the case of $1 bills with the Where's George project, or books with Book Crossing. And finally, on the more futuristic side of things, we've got the Addicted Products project, which was an experiment which tried to see what would happen if objects in the IoT had a sort of attitude, such as with Brad the Toaster, who was a toaster who was addicted to use, and if he felt neglected, would tweet about it to his object friends, and then try and sell himself on eBay. So kind of a thing of agency there. Right, so having said all that, what we are looking at is more the lifelong digital footprints, because there is a little bit of a knowledge gap. You see, we don't really know how this footprint evolves over the lifetime of objects, from their design, their inception, their creation, their use, the transferal, their death, or whatever. And there is relatively little guidance as to how you can develop and design objects with such footprints, or how to apply these footprints to existing objects. And there are also emergent effects that we know quite a little bit about, because how would objects with such footprints that you can access influence our relationships with them if they have sort of object memory? If the value is tied to the provenance that we can access and check, how do we verify it's the real thing? How do we verify that that physical object, the data I have in the cloud, is actually linked to it? Then you have issues of privacy. If objects have memory, who owns that memory? Is it the object? Is it the owner? What if the object is passed on to another owner? Can the previous owner still access it? Is it lost? We don't know. So we were trying to investigate this a little bit, and we were looking for appropriate context, an object, if you will, that was self-contained and manageable enough to study, because as you can imagine, this can apply to anything, so could go mad here, but also had a sort of rich existence, so something interesting to look at, and its community would have an existing culture of provenance gathering, so an object that already people cared about enough to actually look at and record what it does or doesn't do and share that stuff. So after we kicked the idea around a little bit, we ended up with miniature wargaming. Now, for those of you who don't know, very quickly, miniature wargaming is the pastime of collecting miniature models that you paint and build yourself, and then having tabletop gameplay sessions with them. Now, there's a pretty strong case for this choice. You see, miniature wargaming is a collection of activities, all of which are inherently focused on the physical objects themselves. And we also had very strong indications that provenance, gathering, tracking, and sharing was a key part of pretty much all these activities. Additionally, we are based in Nottingham, which happens to be the home of Games Workshop, which is the world's largest and most successful war games company with the Warhammer franchise. So we had access to a very large and active community. So, at this point, we didn't really have much knowledge of wargaming at this point, so it was the time that we had to do an ethnography basically to understand wargaming and focus specifically on the miniatures, how they were treated and perceived by the community. So for about 6 months, I was chosen to go native, follow a series of courses, participate and observe in quite a few games, all things you'd expect. And this was so we could get that insider's understanding of what it really means, what is going on, and what these models basically mean to their owners. I'll try to convey that hopefully over the next few slides. So, the miniatures. Well, it turns out they're a rather interesting case of object. You see, as a physical object, they are the product of a very involved creative process, being painstakingly built, painted, collected. And you have to keep in mind, these are like an inch tall, so it takes a little bit of dedication to do this. But they also have some properties that transcend that physical nature. You see, they are representations of both a theme, a background, or a lore, if you will, but also of rules and game mechanics. So in the first case, you can imagine not just a generic guy with a sword. In the eyes of the hobbyists who have read up on this thing, they are that ex-hero guy or that famous regiment or whatever, so they represent something there. While in gameplay terms, a soldier is a soldier, as a tank is a tank, they have certain abilities or limitations. So again, they represent something. So they're more than just plastic and metal to the hobbyists. Now, we'll have a look at a few of the key stages in this life of miniatures sort of thing. So the first stage is the building stage. It's that creative process we just discussed where the idea of what a hobbyist is going to build, he says, okay, I'm going to make this or I'm going to make that. They put it together, then they paint it. This is a long process, lasts quite a few months actually. But through that process, a footprint is generated. The idea of what it is and what it represents, the techniques used, the paint schemes, all sorts of things, quite a bit of data. And what we saw was the hobbyists trying to record this with as much detail as possible, as many techniques as they had the means to, basically, and then share it with a variety of techniques again. And they did this not just for bragging rights, but also because it was treated as craft knowledge, as community craft knowledge that they had to share to further the thing as a whole. But also to showcase the effort they went to, why this model is important to them, all the things they had to do to make it. Basically boiled down to, look, I made this thing myself. And following that stage, we have the gameplay stage, the sort of where the magic happens, basically. And what happens basically is the hobbyists have a collection of miniatures from which they form cohesive armies in gameplay terms using gameplay rules, and this is the process of army list building. An army list is basically the roster of what miniatures you're taking to a specific game. And things get interesting here. You see, the gaming and metagaming that goes on in Wargaming is a completely different discussion we won't be having here. But what is interesting here is what happens with regards to the events on the table. You see, the gameplay is a strange fusion of deterministic and indeterministic gameplay, meaning up to a certain point, you decide what's going on. You can imagine a thing, you decide what's going to move where, what's going to shoot at what, etc. But from that point on, it's indeterministic. It's out of your hands. The success or failure of these actions is not up to you. It's basically up to chance because through the use of dice. So what that basically means is, on the roll of a dice, a miniature might be a tabletop hero, or he might be a spectacular failure. And this means that through the gameplay, we get emergent narratives, stories, and events, which in the eyes of the hobbyist are quite something to see. And also, the models start gaining sort of battlefield performance provenance. Some of them do well, some of them do bad, some of them keep going doing well. And that influences how the hobbyists feel about the miniatures. They might always take their lucky guy, whatever he looks like. They might never take someone who doesn't do well. And they recognize this, and they try to, again, just like with the building process, try to record it. And this is an activity that is referred to as battle reporting, where again, with whatever means they have, they will try to capture all the events on the tabletop and then share them through a variety of quite elaborate and idiosyncratic means in some cases. So, following that, actually some examples of all those things we just discussed. So I do apologize for the people in the back, quite a few images and rather small. So on the left here we have examples of those army lists which range from quite simple examples of stuff scribbled down to elaborate artistic, this is what I'm bringing, down to almost power gaming level stands of bits of software dedicated to what you're going to bring and performance levels, percentages, and also provenance tracking. In the middle we have examples of battle reports. In this case, at the top, we've got video battle reports from YouTube channels, quite a few per week. While at the bottom we have examples of battle recreations turn by turn using dedicated software. Again, these are shared with the community, not only to show those stories and narratives that emerge, but also for performance and stats tracking, basically. While on the edge we have an interesting case, because you see, we said that these stories are identified and celebrated by the community. So when you go to a tournament, they won't just give you a award for first, second, third place or whatever. They will also try and identify the most interesting narrative. So in this case, it's the single most heroic act, I believe, award, which is attributed to the miniature kind of thing. So there is another stage, and this is what basically goes on after miniatures are built and when they're not in use. And that is, they are treated as objects to be on display, to be proud of and shown. So usually they'll either be on display in the wargamer's home, or they might be loaned out to a local gaming club on a sort of rotating display. And when this happens, they are most usually accompanied by some sort of provenance data, usually in the simple of a sign or a plaque extolling either the virtues on the tabletop or the efforts they went to build them, but they can also get as elaborate as whole thematic dioramas, again, trying to describe what they are. So from all this, what do we sort of learn? What are the implications? So the first thing that hit us was how even an object that has a sort of singular reason to be, a wargaming miniature, you just assume it only does one thing, actually has a rather complex existence. They do have, we had examples here, some of them actually, where the models had that sort of ideal life. They were bought, they were built, they were painted, and then they were used in gameplay and displayed all nice and well. Some of them sort of never reached that full potential in a sort of way. Well, we saw examples of others which sort of went that way, then they were traded, then repainted, changed identity, all sorts of things. But what really struck us was that throughout all these processes, there was that rich data footprint that the hobbyists did identify and they did want to collect. Therefore, there was found to be scope for using HCI and IoT technology to support these practices. Basically, augment, deepen, and expand the data that they could capture, the processes they used, and the methods they used to share it. So, for example, augmented reality for the display itself. However, and this would be sort of the takeaway caveat, whatever you do, you have to do it carefully. Because, sure, it's easy to tech up any such process, but it's too easy to interfere with the core. So we had a lot of examples where people said, yes, throw as much tech as this as possible, but a lot of people, there was a lot of natural resistance saying, sure, you can automate all these processes, the process of rolling the dice, but that will ruin it for me. The other thing we would like to propose for this is extending the trajectories framework, which was initially conceived for user experience design but has since been applied to game design and evaluation, to basically the trajectories of things. Now, the trajectories framework has three main types of trajectories. The canonical, which describes the designed or expected life. So in terms of user experience, it would be what the designer anticipated the user will do. In terms of miniatures, might be that canonical life as it should be used. The participant trajectory is actually what happens, so that natural deviations from what we thought. So in physical object terms, it might be that, hey, we bought this thing, but we never actually put it together, never brought it to a game. While in thematic terms, while I have made something to represent something specific, it might have never lived up to its potential on the table. But the takeaway one here is the historical trajectory, which is basically reflects the need to tell stories. And as we saw, that is a key part of this whole pastime. Finally, because we're sort of running out of time, what we're up to next? Well, over the next few months, we're going to be running a series of participatory design workshops with experts from the community in order to test a series of technological prototypes that we've carefully designed not to influence the core practices too much, just to support them and augment them. And basically, we're trying to introduce the models to the Internet of Things, seeing as they're not inherently part of it, and see what happens, compare the previous provenance gathering methods and results to what might happen next. And moving on from that, we're hoping to generalize to other contexts and maybe get some design guidelines of how to do that. And for example, another project that started very recently in the Mixed Reality Lab is that of the Caroline Guitar Project. So in this case, we'd be applying the same sort of thinking to musical instruments. This is basically a guitar we have designed and built in the lab. It is chock full of tracking technology, so you can basically see its whole footprint online. Basically, I'd love to talk to you about this more, but it's a completely different discussion. Please ask me later. And I believe that's pretty much it.
Any questions?
Hi, Jeff Warshaw, UC Santa Cruz. I'm curious, did you talk to players about how they felt about this kind of augmenting their traditional, metal and plastic with some kind of technological tracking?
Indeed, we did. So we got a lot of opinions here. First, we got the enthusiasm where people were like, yes, I've always wished that we could augment this. You showed them an example of augmented reality, or most of them had already seen it. And you can see this because there's like at least 10 Kickstarter projects about augmenting the tabletop. And the initial enthusiasm of, yes, we can automatically count the dice, so we can have visual effects, so we can instantly track this. But after a while, they'd be, sure, but you know, it's gonna interfere. It's gonna some of them were straight out saying, yeah, you're kind of missing the point here. Why not just play a video game at this point? But they said, okay, a balance. But that's why we ended up, and they agreed with this, and hence what we're doing with the prototypes is just supporting those practices in the background. So yes, have tech supporting the gameplay, for example, but from a distance safely, mostly for the provenance recording, not to take away the actions you're doing, so to speak.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask one question then? Because I was wondering, you really nicely talked about, you know, like your research interest, and then you talked about, like, you know, the motivation behind the work, and then you talked about that you had this massive community in your home city. But how did that project come about? Like, did you go to them and thought, oh, here's an opportunity? Did they come to you and say, help us? Or how did it all start?
I'm not sure how familiar with Games Workshop's history, which is sort of esoteric, as in they don't work with anybody. They did definitely not come to us. Anything they do is behind closed doors. But we started with a project, started getting into the space, and slowly they took notice. And at this point, we do have a sort of working relationship. So definitely not a project instigated by them. That answers the question.
Cool, thank you. Well, let's thank Dimitri again. Thank you.